Hi, I'm Eric Hutchinson. I'm the principal broker and owner of Hutchinson Realty. Welcome to video 24 of the Negotiating Your Next Home video series. I hope you'll watch the other videos in the series because we have covered some really good topics. We went over the residential contract and the new construction contract. We went over the inspection, repair, and survey addendum. And today we're going to be talking about the early occupancy addendum. This relates to item number 23 on the real estate contract that deals with possession date. That is move-in day. That's whenever it's really exciting for the buyers to get to the property, get the keys to the property, move into the property, and normally that happens on closing date. However, sometimes the buyer needs to move in early. So we're going to be talking about when that happens. Now, it doesn't happen a lot, and it almost never happens with new construction because once the buyer moves in, the house is no longer considered new construction. So normally this is on resale homes. It's possible to happen on new construction, just not likely. Now, I'm not an attorney. Let me give you a disclaimer. I'm not an attorney and I cannot give you legal advice. But whenever a buyer moves into the property before closing, or if the seller stays in the property after closing, that's called a delayed occupancy. We'll talk about that in the next video. But if that happens, there's some liability problems. The buyer moves in, doesn't really own the property. What happens if someone gets hurt? What happens if the house burns down? What happens if the buyer does damage and then decides to back out of the deal? There's all kinds of problems with the buyer moving in early. So we're going to talk about the early occupancy addendum and what that means for the buyer and for the seller. So let's get into it a little bit. So I want to talk about the addendum in general at first. The early occupancy addendum is exactly what it says. It is an addendum to the real estate contract, and it clearly states at the very beginning regarding the real estate contract form serial number, and then there's the serial number. So it is an addendum. Notice the all caps and bolded header at the top of the addendum. This early occupancy addendum is not intended for any occupancy in excess of 60 days. So if the buyer is going to move into the property and plan to stay there for 3, 4, 5, 6 months or longer before they close, we just do a lease agreement because that's really what needs to happen is the buyer just needs to lease the property prior to closing. However, if it's 60 days or less, then we do what we call an early occupancy addendum. And then we look at it day by day by day is how it's looked at in real estate terms. So I'm going to zoom in so that you can kind of see the paragraphs individually. So paragraph 1 says that this early occupancy addendum is for the purpose of providing occupancy at an earlier date than the closing date established by the real estate contract. Item paragraph number 2 says buyer shall pay to the seller the sum of, now I've put in $40 per day. That's $1,200 per month. That may or may not be what is done depending on the house. It may be a bigger house. It may be a smaller house. And the seller can just choose to let the buyer in for a few days. So let's say that the closing was supposed to happen on a Friday afternoon, but the funds were not exchanged over to the seller by the end of the Friday, by the end of the date. And so we have to actually move the closing date to Monday. Well, the seller may say, hey, I'm just going to give you a couple days occupancy there in the house before we actually close. Maybe all the papers have been signed. The money just hasn't been transferred. And sometimes the seller will just let the buyer go ahead and move in. But sometimes they don't let him just go ahead and move in. Sometimes they have the right to charge rent. And so they may charge rent. But if it's going to be like 10, 20, 30, 40 days before the buyer is going to be able to close, then usually there is rent charged. And so just for the sake of this video, we're going to say $40 per day, and the possession date will actually take place on October 29th. Now I say that, but there's another item number 11, that says effective possession date. And we'll talk about that here in a moment. But this is the date here that when the rent starts. So the rent will start on October 29th. And it basically says that the buyer is going to pay rent as soon as they get the keys and take possession. They're going to start paying $40 a day, according to what I've got written in here. However, the buyer and the seller are going to estimate the amount of days it's going to take to close and that the buyer is going to be in the property prior to closing. So let's just say it's going to be 30 days. That would be $1,200 that the buyer would pay the seller at the possession date. If the buyer closes early, let's say he closes 10 days early on November 19th, then the buyer would get a credit at closing for $400 because he closed 10 days earlier. So also, if they close after that date, then the buyer would actually owe the seller at closing for more days after the closing date. So that's kind of what paragraph 2 is talking about. Paragraph 3 just says that there is a deposit that is given, kind of like a pet deposit or a cleaning deposit would normally be done on a property management agreement or a lease agreement for a buyer or a tenant. So it is not a requirement, but if the buyer is going to be in the property 30 days before they close, it would be wise for the seller to gain a deposit. Now, this is almost the same thing as a non-refundable deposit that we talked about in our real estate contract. You can go back and watch that video. This deposit is non-refundable if the buyer does not close. Let's move over to the next page. Item number 4 talks about the buyer does not close for any reason, then it just says exactly what I just said about the previous paragraph, that the buyer does not get that money back and that they have to vacate the property within 10 days of receipt of written notice. So if the buyer says, no, I'm not going to close, the seller goes, well, then you've got 10 days to get out of the property. Now, there's another reason why the buyer would be asked to leave the property. And we'll talk about that again in just a moment. Let's go to paragraph 5. Buyer shall do no work in or to the property prior to closing without written permission. Sometimes the buyer wants to repaint or recarpet or put in different tile or floors or countertops. But it just clearly states they can't do that until we actually close on the property. Because again, if the closing doesn't happen, then they've done damage to the property or they've changed the property. And the seller may or may not want that. Item number 6 says buyer agrees to carry utilities in buyer's name from possession time to closing date or vacating the property. So that makes sense, right? The buyer's going to be moving in prior, then they put the utilities in their name. Number 7 is really important, and they've got a bolded sentence here. Buyer and seller are strongly advised to consult their respective insurance agents to ensure proper coverage. Keep in mind, the property has not changed ownership. The seller still owns the property. Therefore, they need to have insurance, but the buyer needs to have personal property insurance and liability insurance in case someone gets hurt on the property. And so buyer and seller are both strongly urged to talk to their insurance companies. That's a big deal. Let's move over to paragraph number 8. Buyer shall assume all responsibility for the property from the possession date and shall be solely responsible for any maintenance or repairs on the property. So if the air conditioner goes out during the time between possession and closing, the buyer's in the property and the air conditioner goes out, who pays for that? Well, according to this paragraph, the buyer has to pay for that. The buyer has already done a home inspection on the property. And when they move into the property, according to this addendum, they are taking possession and they're taking on all responsibility of all repairs and maintenance of the property from this time forward. Paragraph 9 says that the right of the buyer to occupy the property shall be on a day-to-day basis. Now, remember earlier I said the buyer would have 10 days to get out of the property if they didn't close. Well, this paragraph deals with if the buyer does something that makes the seller go, you know what? I've decided that you need to get out of the property. You're either doing damage, you're causing problems, or something's happening, and the seller says, I want you out immediately. Well, the seller still has to provide written notice, and now the buyer only has 3 days following written notice to get out of the property. This is different than if the property just doesn't close. So if this would be something the buyer's doing, the seller says you need to get out of the property, and so the buyer is given 3 days to do so. Number 10 is a blank, and realtors have to be really careful about writing things in the blank here. But this is when maybe the buyer is only going to have access to the garage. So let's just use that as an example. And I've written in here, buyer will only use the garage and not move items into heated and cool portion of the house. So that happens quite a bit. Sometimes the buyer says, I just need to move my furniture into storage and I don't want to pay for storage, would you allow me to put it into the garage for a few days before we close on the property? And the seller goes, sure. And so sometimes we would say the buyer's not going to pay any rent, but they're going to have access to the garage. And so this is where we would put those kind of things, item number 10. And then item number 11 is what we talked about earlier, is the effective date. So for instance, the buyer says, I want to take possession on October 29th, but maybe I'm going to actually move in on October 30th. And so you might have a different date here, but most of the time, the effective date is the same date that the rent starts. And so I've got October 29th, which is what I also have on the rent date on the page 1. So that pretty much covers it. I know I've unpacked a lot of information. I hope it's been helpful to you. It's really better if on item number 23 on the contract that the buyer takes possession upon closing. That's letter A on item number 23 on the contract. And so that's the best case scenario. It's a clean cut deal. The buyer takes possession, the seller gives possession. The seller's no longer going to have insurance on the property. The buyer is now the owner of the property. That's easy. And that's the cleanest way to do it. You can always reach out to me at info@hutchrealty.com, or you can message me from this video. I hope you'll tune in next time when we talk about delayed occupancy, which is when the seller stays in the property after closing. And we'll talk more about that then. I hope you have a blessed day, and I hope things go well for your next home purchase. Good luck in negotiating your next home.